The first guest for this season of the Collector's Call is Martin Lukas Ostachowski.
As an artist and crypto art historian, Martin is the perfect person to get us started in our quest to learn about crypto art.
Martin has done a lot of research into the origins of crypto art, and he has even created a timeline that tracks the evolution of this art movement.
We ask Martin about where crypto art came from, and we also ask him whether, as some have claimed, it is now dead. Spoiler alert, it's not.
We also have a chance to ask Martin about some of the crypto art he creates.
This episode is packed with information that you're sure to enjoy. Without further ado, let's dive into this conversation with Martin. I'm curious, in your own words, what crypto art means to you.
My definition of crypto art changed over the years. I started very much from a technical approach where I noticed people were just using NFTs abundantly without even knowing that they're referring to non-NFTs the whole time. So in my first definition models, I basically divided it into 3 segments, right? So we have basically untokenized art, which is conceptually fused to the blockchain. And here, having re-up recently on the pod will help because projects like Is Art and other elements, these are like great examples of using the technology, creating artwork, which is not necessarily represented by some sort of token, but can exist in itself, but utilizes the technology. That was kind of like the first category for me because it was entirely neglected for years, right? The second category was then the whole element of fungible tokens, right? You have like social tokens, you have like conceptual tokens like Kevin DeBosch's I'm a Coin or others, which have definitely a strong conceptual background and intention, but are discussed as NFTs, which they're not, right? They're not fungible. They're actually very fungible. And people just started representing all of that as NFTs, which is for me then the third category, having basically these elements of non-fungibility and being represented as individual tokens, be it to which extent it always evolves, with the image, without the image, on-chain, off-chain, whatsoever. But these were the 3 elements which my definition models always started with. Now, over the years, I got the opportunity to talk a lot about crypto art, and I always found that for me, the common denominator was really the values. I am in the process of doing a large crypto art survey with artists trying to find some sort of common ground and adding to the very, very few resources we have in the space for newcomers or people who are interested in the space to really find some sort of guidance in what is this really all about. And by canvassing basically a lot of the peers, I hope to see how did the values change over time, because already in the sample size I have, you see clearly the priorities start to shift, and also there's some sort of common ground for everybody. And for somebody who's new in this space, what is it all about for us in that sense, right? The value aspect to it is for me always like the common denominator, and that's more important for me than some sort of aesthetic. And that's also a part which I find is recently getting lost in the conversation. And this is, I think, where it comes for me interesting to see how also the definition changed, right? Because we had crypto art, which had always like a strong relationship to the subject matter of crypto, be it activism or some sort of like mimetic documentation of the history. And then, with the pouring in of new people and demonstrating very little interest in the values, then you see really the emergence of the terms like NFT artist, NFT art, because we are reducing it basically at its core to the medium and no longer are interested in what it represents for artists, for society, or whatsoever.
That's so true. So true. It feels like in the recent couple of years, ever since money became a really big deal, there's been a bit of a dilution of what some of those values have meant. I saw that the end of your essay in Crypto Art Begins references the beginning of the bear market that entered. And in some way, people like you were welcoming a decline from some of the frenzy that had happened to allow maybe a return of some of those earlier values that seem to have a lot more longevity and more meaning behind them. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you think are some of these values that trump aesthetics that are significant within the crypto art sphere.
Well, and here I'm kind of like on thin ice, right? Because I don't want to take away from all the survey work and documentation I do. But I can tell you, I always see really our value base much rooted in the cypherpunk movement, We have seen when it emerged in the economic crisis, it was embedded in an ideological movement. We had the cypherpunks, which were like these cryptography pioneers, which were very concerned about where are we shifting as a society. We're seeing the opportunity, but also the risks of technology. And as such, they recognized very early that we need to protect ourselves. And when Bitcoin launched in this network, for many, Bitcoin wasn't even radical enough. It was like, hey, even that could be exploited, it's not anonymous enough. But we went ahead and a lot of these ideas, of like decentralization, taking ownership and the right to be anonymous, all of these elements, which were very important in the early years of crypto art, that really derived from that area. And what I found fascinating is, I don't know to which extent you participated or observed the whole ICO bubble. You see a lot of these values really made it into these white papers. Right? Like it was all about like, we want to democratize the art, we want to bank the unbanked, all ideas, right? Which originate in these ideas of the cypherpunks, where we say we need to empower the powerless and we need to control the ones in power. And it was just like basically lip service, right? If we're honest about it. And I think it's interesting to see that for people earlier in the space, this is more than that, right? This is really some sort of ideology which resonates with people. A lot of people who have been in the artwork before also saw the big opportunity of change. And for me, it was like, okay, the whole crypto art movement started. We were celebrating ourselves. We were a small, fair group. And then, these words come up with like Web3 Renaissance. For me, the Web3 Renaissance is yet to come because we were on the right path, but it seems we had pivoted 180 degrees and we moved exactly in the direction which we wanted to leave.
Yeah, this is a good note to end on for that question, because you spoke about this at NFC Lisbon. I sadly couldn't be there. Can you give us a bit more of a hint as to what that talk covered and what you see coming or hope to see coming down the road?
Sure. For me, the way I saw it was, what was the Renaissance all about, right? We had very indestructible power structures. We had like the church, we had nobility, and for the vast majority of people, it was impossible to break structures. So what Renaissance brought, they brought basically elements to kind of dilute this power structure, right? It was like education, it was like, the shift towards humanism. There was a lot of elements which kind of untangled the right or the privilege towards something which is more distributed and more accessible alternative. And I think as such, it was very easy to see then the parallel to the art world, where we had also these established power structures, right? We had like a gallery system, we had social media monopolies, and we had this very gatekeeper tier level system where it's like a very narrow and linear path for people to make it in the art world. So Web3 then came in and brought an approach, a technology, which basically can extend the very limited access to people in the art world towards being part of the art world in a much, much shorter life cycle. Because if you are experienced with the traditional art, it takes many, many years until you get to sell or to offer your artwork to sell, and even more to do it like in a more professional environment. And that's basically brought this time to a fraction. So people were able to participate in some sort of art market, being even newcomers to the space or being like early stage artists. And that's, I think, what really encouraged and excited a lot of people, because they were really frustrated with the system. It's like a multi-year system. It's very opaque. It is unfair. It's not necessarily merit-based. And here you bring in something which could radically change that. So what was the talk about is that, okay, so we are celebrating ourselves now as the Renaissance, and we use this technology. And then suddenly we see that with the increased interest, we attract people who are extracted, right? We have venture capitalists coming in. We have consolidation of marketplaces happening. We see, venture capital taking part of infrastructure over. We see influencers being, again, empowered. And for me, that is the pivot, right? We really return to what we wanted to leave, because we are, again, building up these power structures. We embrace traditional auction houses, which have a very blatant disregard to transparency, right? I mean, until today, we don't know who's bidding, what is the bidding amount. And this is just mind-boggling to me that we accept that. I think the whole space was about radical transparency. And honestly, I was excited to see the traditional auction houses taking notice, right? Because at the end of the day, it is some sort of art institution. It gave some sort of validation, but the validation should have taken on our conditions, right? At the values and milestones we have achieved as like a movement. And instead, the attraction of participating at these auction houses for some were enough to basically throw over all of the achievements we wanted to see. And I think that's where for me, it's like we're going back, right? That's why it's like yet to come for me, because we were not able to establish these values or these things we wanted to change, but instead we are just returning exactly back to very few, very powerful people. And this long bear market got people in the form of desperation that we give up this idea of centralization. We saw an emergence in the last years of level 2 chains, other blockchains, which have nothing to do with blockchain anymore for me. I have said it in the past, but for instance, Base, the corporate structure. It's not a decentralized blockchain in the sense that, it is one company behind it. And with that, how can it be a center or a playground for culture if it is basically a monopolized element, which could be censored, which could be turned off? Oh, it's the same thing with Solana, a chain which you can turn off for days and hours. I mean, how is this basically a building block for our culture in the future? And I think that's where we kind of lost ourselves. So we're just not able ever to establish a strong enough value set or education on the very ground that this whole grassroots movement became more and more corporate structure again.
Great observations. It certainly has felt like the mass adoption, which was initially welcomed, lost some of those values. I skipped ahead a little bit here. I'm wondering if you can take us back a bit to talk about the timeline of crypto art. Can you take us back to where you trace the beginnings of this movement and what some of the key stages are that you see in the evolution of crypto art or blockchain related art, however you'd like to refer to it?
The timeline itself is still an ongoing project, right? It's evolving. And I think at one point I stated it's kind of doomed to be never complete. But it's interesting because we still discover new artists, new elements, new exhibitions, new projects. And as such, it is evolving. It happened for me really when we start to think about conceptual tokenization, when we move from the idea of some sort of cryptographic assets being able to represent other things than just monetary values. First, on the main coin blockchains, early identities or PFP projects, which were really at the forefront of some sort of customization. When we have the shift towards like physicality, right? The blockchain was just so abstract and so inaccessible that we found these references with mining and minting to make it accessible. And then physical Bitcoins became really such a good icebreaker and discussion piece that there were at one point over 50 manufacturers of these collectibles. There was a need to find some sort of base to communicate, right? And like a physical Bitcoin is much easier to explain than a digital only aspect. So I think where I see it is just like an evolution. And this, I think, one thing which I always try to convey is I see it like as a staircase model, right? Then we have this material identity. Crypto had a very bad reputation with elements like the Silk Road controversy, like Mt. Gox, the hacks. It was very unsexy to be in crypto. And you were put together in a basket with criminals, right? With some sort of scams and fraud. And it was super important to find some sort of identity. And the idea of having Satoshi Nakamoto being falsely identified as Dorian Nakamoto, even knowing that it's a false prophet, but it's always better than none. We just needed some sort of symbol. When you see now how over the years, with everybody knowing that he's not Satoshi, how iconic he became in artworks and exhibitions and articles. If we move then forward, we go towards exploring crypto art really more conceptually. And you have artists like Ria Myers or technologists like Yoni Asai who are proposing elements like the color coins, which play with the idea that, these crypto tokens could actually represent something else than just itself. It could be like an identity. It could be a physical, real world asset or other things. And that's where it opened up very quickly. And really artists were pushing the boundaries. It was just so imaginative that I think a lot of people would not be able to think about that coming like just from a technological aspect. So I think that was pushing the boundaries, but it was also a time where it was still a lot of individuals, right? It was like individual technologists, individual artists, all of them working self-organized in a very small pool, but with some more sorts of organization. And that's, I think, where we enter the next stage where the innovation was driven by companies. And these companies were in the beginning really gaming companies. We see a lot of card games. We see trading card games. And that is fascinating because the idea of cryptographic trading card games goes back to 1993, where Hal Finney already had the idea of crypto trading cards. And that is the fascinating part of it, and people then realized, okay, let's use this as trading cards. And that opened up just a whole new level of onboarding, right? Because people could get around that idea of like, okay, I want to collect a card, which is really unique and provable unique. And that just helped to interest way more people than solely financial aspect to it, right? So we have this segment, which I like to see. It's kind of like the game's origin, which then also shapes to some extent the way we collect our digital art until today, because there's a lot of the gaming aspects to collecting, with these rarities, trades, with drop mechanisms. A lot of that originates to some extent from these gaming elements, because they had to solve a lot of the early problems. They fought with ideas like whitelists and other things to really make sure the right people are getting the right things. And that is to some extent then this one next stage or step, if you want. From there, it went from something which was more entrepreneurial or like company driven to something which turned more towards the community and volunteer based. And that was for me when we start to see these creative communities revolve around projects like Repebase, with all of their, derivatives, Asian derivatives like memory chain or Oasis mining. But this was the phase where it was still prohibitively complex to mint and to be part of it. And volunteers basically came together and said like, hey, just create an artwork and we'll help you creating your NFT. Or in this case, most of them were actually fungible tokens because there were no real standards and there were like a lot of issuance and they're not unique. And I think that was super exciting because it limited this entry barrier. And with that removed, it just gave access to so many more people. And I think one of the reasons why it became so successful is because it made it very easy to be part of it. And it created some sort of like communal aspect, which was lacking before. So these projects, even if most of them stopped in 2018, they had such appeal that most of them reopened as like derivatives in 2022. We saw the fake rares, we say fake commons, we have dank rares, and all sorts of other very similar ideas and concepts, which are really based on the same idea. And from there, I think it shifts towards the digital collectible phase for me, where we enter the time of the curio cards. We have the CryptoPunks, which then create this blueprint for most other profile picture projects later on. And they also elevate this whole standard on the technological side. So very prohibitive Bitcoin transaction costs shifted the interest toward Ethereum, which was back then very accessible. And there, the ERC20 standard was the most popular one. And with CryptoPunks, they really elevated it in some sort of hybrid standard, which had non-fungible elements to it, which then later on was like rolled out as a fully fledged ERC 721 standard when CryptoKitties came, right? But it's a more structured approach, which elevated the space to a new step. From this collectible space, it shifted towards these art marketplaces. We had like games, we had collectibles, artists are entering more and more the space, and they do not feel comfortable having the artwork represented next to like mafia game cards. And that really led to larger development of marketplaces. Concept of these marketplaces date back many years before, but I think around 2017, this was when more and more of these marketplaces emerged. You have like Left Gallery, you have Dada, you have the Super Rares and on Origins. All of that is in a very short period, which I find justifies them to be seen as some sort of like step in this evolution staircase. From there, we see this huge segmentation. For years with no interest, suddenly we have a $60 million sale and everybody's pouring in. And then it's just like a replication of a lot of proven concepts, right? Like a lot of the marketplaces which appeared had really brought nothing new to the table. It was mostly capital driven. And I think what made artists so excited was because some of the curated platforms took a role of a gallery model for them because they helped with the promotion. They gave them access to a collector base. And that was really the main benefit of an art gallery. Otherwise, why don't you sell direct? Because direct, nobody knows you yet, right? It's a very nascent space. You're probably not established. So these curated galleries took over the role of the traditional galleries in bringing collectors and artists together, helping promote their artists, helping to set up live shows and really play that. And I don't know to which extent we want to pivot there at this point, but, we have seen what just happened with foundations, a typical venture capitalist funded project and now they're pulling out. So from this marketplaces space, it was interesting to see more and more the emergence of the metaverse, right? I think this really expanded the use case for NFTs tremendously in a very short time. You had like names, you had properties or like parcels, you had movements, you just expanded the idea of what an NFT could be, right? It's not just an image, it could actually be more. And it also fostered the idea of using the wallet as some sort of identity. And this helped to broaden the adaptation, right? It was like, okay, I'm not interested in art, but I can get around like building and playing around in a three-dimensional space. So it helped us again, moving forward. And, I think from there, it's fairly known to most what happened next. We had elements like royalties, we had elements like this uncontrolled mainstream adoption. You had this evolution of what can an NFT be, trying to make it like continuously evolving, permanent, soulbound, to try to push through the limits of this box. And I think where it gets interesting for me in that regard is that whenever something becomes so oversaturated as it is now with NFTs, it will always force innovation because it is just impossible to stand out if you just do the very same. And I think we see that right now with some of the marketplaces disappearing, with some of these artists who came to quickly extract are disappearing. And we see already people building really interesting stuff again. And I think that's where it gets me exciting to see just what is the next wave.
Yes, that is something that's very exciting. What's coming? That was a wonderful walk through the evolution of crypto art and a lot of the innovations and experimentation within this sphere. You referenced Foundation as well, which has been the discussion of the week. There was one other conversation this week, which I thought was a little bit interesting. There was a poll on Twitter asking if crypto art was dead, and 65% of respondents said that it was either close to dying or it had died. And I was curious to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I might have a bit more polarizing opinion on that. For me, crypto art is definitely not dead. For me, all the crypto artists are still around. For me, it just shows us that a lot of people have no idea what crypto art is. So for market imitators, people who are copying marketplaces, people who just see it as a quick get-rich asset, that is kind of being fleshed out. And that was never part of crypto art for me. So, a lot of the players, a lot of the influencers, a lot of the marketplaces, which we see disappearing, were never really part of crypto art for me. So for me, nothing changed. I see, yes, some of the really good grassroots crypto marketplaces have shut down, but it's a cyclical space like everything else in life. I would hope that value-based players will return when the environment permits it. But a lot of what we've seen being lamented was never part of crypto art, like thinking that you can create thousands of derivatives and all of them will be meaningful is just like naive, right? If you look at it, what happened over the past few years, it's just natural that it was not sustainable, right? It was just expanding too fast. So a contraction is just natural. And I think people seeing that crypto art is dead, I would always encourage to understand first what for people who have been longer in this space, crypto art really is. And I think that brings me back again to my survey, where I find a lot of people who I consider crypto artists, they're undeterred. They keep creating, they keep working, they're fairly unaffected by the noise, if you want, because that is not what matters to them. And it's hopefully a time where the discussion revolves more around the art and the price. Like a discussion I had with Pinder, where we came to the conclusion that we don't need 1,000 artists making $1 million. We need 1 million artists making $1,000. This is really what is more exciting. We should focus again on interesting artworks, on interesting artists, on development, on artistic creation, elevating conceptual achievements, and not just like, okay, I can exit that to X in 3 weeks. And I think that is what is gone. And I think good riddance. I am an artist and I want to be an artist my entire life. So I have no incentive to exit the space, right? So I don't need my exit activity. You know what I mean? Like I want to create art my whole life. So it's hard for me sometimes to understand how impatient people get. Like, what is your objective? Like you see yourselves like in 2 years selling at Christie's, being at all the museums. This is not how the traditional art would work. So why do you expect that for the crypto space? So I guess for me, it really didn't change much. We see the landscape is changing. We see the discussion shifting away from interesting achievements like concepts like royalties, which were very ideological, but technically never really worked. I think we're going to see that shifting hopefully to something which is more like a social contract idea. These are the developments which I find more interesting. Seeing a lot of these investment platforms, which were avoiding royalties, which were basically gamifying collecting to just collecting other shitcoins and airdrops and whatever. If all that flushes out, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world.
Well said. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's exciting if we can see a bit of a return to the values that gave birth to so much wonderful art within this space, be they from creators or from platforms, but a return away from that brink of chasing after speculation and money. I'd love to hear what you think are some of the key works of crypto art that you come back to as good examples of it, whether you like them or not. I'm sure you fall on different sides of these things, but are there some that you return to as essential works in the crypto art pantheon?
I always try to evade this question. And that's also the reason why I chose the timeline as the format, because using the timeline allows me to follow a more academic approach. I think that is the beauty of it, that, you can, by creating a sufficient large enough pool of things which merit some sort of mention, you can choose out of it yourself, which you deem important. I think honestly, it's also very early to find these iconic pieces because, what's the expectation? People release artwork and 2 days later, it's like, oh my God, this is a forever grail. No, how could you know that? And that's a thing where I also started to offset my timeline. I have right now roughly 500 milestones, and I have about 500 milestones in the backlog. And it's super hard for me to maintain that. And I still work in a day job. So it's hard to justify the expectation that, oh, you did something, or like this exhibition, it just happened like 2 months ago. It is part of the history. It's like, yeah, yes and no, right? And I think this is where the timeline format was great for me because it offered me some sort of like exit of judgment, right? It doesn't make me a tastemaker. It just makes me a collector of references, right? There's like a lot of elements which are undefined, but I think it's good that we have also alternative sources, right? Because what I'm interested in particular is that we explore crypto art more on an academic level, right? I'm working right now for a Canadian art magazine with a paper. A few months ago, I was at the Auto Art Gallery talking about NFTs, and I think this is exciting. This is what we need. We need more engagement with traditional players, but on a more academic base, because what I see is a lot of the storytelling and historization is done by commercial entities, which have a fairly open and visible agenda, right? So you see companies making their own timelines and including their own projects and artists. And that is where it's important that we also have alternatives. And I think the academic world has been in the past pretty good in preserving some of these ideas and concepts, which are not necessarily only monetary.
Yes, that's a great point. It does seem like there's a dearth of formal academics around this. You've been involved in a handful of the publications that actually exist and name crypto art as a genre within them. It certainly seems like that's challenging in the face of the public as well, given that some of the ideologies that underpin crypto art could be construed as fringe, and memetics are hard for the public, let alone academia, to really wrap their heads around. How do you see us threading the needle on that? How do you push this forward and get some traction?
Well, I think just in general by publishing. I did read a fairly good amount of papers. It's just also funny how sometimes mistakes are reciprocated, right? Because if somebody decides, okay, this is how it should be, and then everybody else is citing that, we see some very interesting statement being repeated. And I think that is where it's exciting to just bring in new viewpoints and new articles and keep this conversation going. This whole citing aspect to it does bring some sort of accountability, which I think is great. Because, everybody can claim, but if you have to prove it, a lot of projects or a lot of ideas disappear again. Benoit from the French Museum of Crypto Art helped me in the early years of my timeline to really make Wikipedia a home of it, right? And we started several times the Cryptoart article with all the sources. And this is where I was just completely deleted because, they say like, okay, a Bitcoin talk forum is not a source. So like this and this is not a source. A timestamp is not a source. And this is where it's get interesting, right? What do you consider a source? It's super tedious to still look in these very rudimentary archives forum and Reddit forum for some sort of history. But at the same time, this is just the nature of how this movement developed. And I think as such, we will have to find some sort of consolidation in what is accepted as a source. It's a difficult question to answer. There's also new spheres popping up like digital humanities, which really changes the idea of how research is done or what is being considered research. And I think we're adopting to it. It's just very nascent. It's very evolving. I think traditionally academia evolves much slower, but it's adapting to it to some extent.
It's wonderful that you're doing this work because, as you say, so many elements of it exist online. And so getting that into somewhere where it will live longer to commemorate that history is important. I should confirm as well, because I know you've referenced this in your writings, you differentiate between blockchain-related art, which can include physical artwork, and crypto art, which would be exclusively artwork that, I forget your term exactly for it, I think engages
conceptually
with the blockchain. There we are. Yeah. Does that still hold true?
I do believe so, yeah. I do believe so. Basically, blockchain related can be anything which uses a subject matter, uses cryptocurrency, because even if it doesn't sound very exciting, if you think about it, in I think it was 2018 or 19, there was a UK artist which made like a huge exhibition and all of his work was exclusively available through Bitcoin. And that created international news and that led to adoption, right? I like to call it activism, Bitcoin activism, right? To educate people, interest people in the subject. And then you have also elements which, which don't need necessarily to be digital, but it can be still blockchain related. And I think the aspect where it turned crypto art for me, it was really digital. It was basically native to the underlying technology, if you want.
Makes sense. Thanks for clarifying that. I had one more question as well, which is, do you see any precursors to crypto art? I know you've referenced Hal Finney talking about the idea that you could have cryptography related to trading cards. But I'm curious, in other art movements, are there stylistic or ideological similarities that you've seen evolve into what we now have as the crypto art movement? Or is that still unexplored terrain?
I think I have not done enough work to really say something really smart, but I definitely see some elements to it deriving in the idea of concept art itself. The idea of we defy the idea of what an artwork can be and should be. I think in a lot of ways, I see a lot of parallels to the idea of concept art itself. If you think about it, we are attributing value to just some code, right? And consider this code to be representational of an art or a concept, right? I think that itself is just beautifully repeated or evolved from the idea what concept art was and is. Other than that, I think I would have not made enough research to say something meaningful, but I think that is for me one of the aspects where I see it.
I would love to hear about some of your pieces. I think the dominant image that people associate with your work are clouds. They're a prominent recurring theme. Can you talk a little bit about how you've integrated that motif with the theme of crypto through some of your various works?
Sure. Clouds were for me always a representation of two things, right? It has a very personal aspect to it. Like I've been some sort of nomad, if you want to. I've moved over 34 times by now, and clouds became some sort of my constant, right? So there's this personal connection to clouds and traveling, which has been always like parts of my life and work. Then when I was working on my first pieces of crypto art, I was very much fascinated by the technology itself, right? So I had like people referencing technical aspects to it and using artwork to explain. So this is where always kind of like some sort of educational part or component was part of my art, because I was fascinated by the aspect that how blockchain as a technology will be transformational for society, right? It's like AI, it's like this digital transformation, it's blockchain will be part of our future. To which extent it will be recognized as we're being using it conscientiously as blockchain or not, it's going to be part of our life, be it part of as like ledger for our medical records, voting or whatsoever. It's going to be more and more integrated in our life without probably us knowing about it. So I think the knowledge about it is super interesting and important to be not left out in this conversation, right? Because I think with all these accelerators we have, AI and others, we're going to see a lot of even white collar works becoming maybe redundant or, being forced into adaptation. I think the earlier people know about it, the more interesting it gets. So coming from, exploring elements visually to explain blockchain, clouds became for me the perfect symbol for it, because they were basically representing intangibility, right? We have like these intangible values. They were representing the idea that we are moving permissionless across borders, right? So we have the idea of permissionless monitors. The blockchain evolves with each block, and that's the same with the clouds. It's never static. It keeps evolving continuously. And then you have also this aspect, which I find often underrepresented in art, and that's the fragility to it, right? We see that, it's at the end of the day, the blockchain is a social construct. So it's people believing in it, which makes it real. And if people would stop believing in it, and would disconnect their nodes, the whole network would just collapse and disappear. And this is, I think, where the cloud, again, was a very fitting motive, because the cloud can evaporate itself. Lastly, what I found super exciting is that it worked as a cultural symbol across nations, right? The clouds are mostly associated with either very positive or even like and that across cultures. So I have not found really any reference of clouds in a negative context, other than like maybe a dark cloud as like a dooming cloud, or like an indicator of something, but in a general positive aspect. And that's been fantastic as a symbol to explore, because we've been using clouds in art since like centuries. So it is very accessible for people. Everybody sees it across the world, right? So it's not something which is like far from everybody's heart and reality. But at the same time, it's a perfect way to lure people in, and then, allow them to dissect it and learn a bit about Bitcoin or crypto.
It's a great all-encompassing image. It looks like you've got a version of it on your hat here as well. That's a fitting emblem for yourself. You recently created a complex installation work, Proof of Work 3. And I'd love to hear a bit about how that was exhibited and what you set out to achieve with that piece.
Sure. So basically, there was an exhibition coming up in Austria at the Francisco Carolino, which is a fairly media-oriented art museum in Austria. And they invited basically artists who are at the same times, involved or having punks to exhibit their art and use the CryptoPunks as the common denominator for representing kind of like the crypto art movement. And as such, I was thinking about it. What could I do or contribute to this exhibition, which would be interesting and would be at the same time tying in a lot of things of my own work into it. And I think I basically proposed to create a new work. And that work was basically incorporating a lot of elements like my work with stamps, using physical work and my research. So I basically depicted over 6 meters, or it's like 40 feet, 30 feet, basically the history of CryptoPunks visually. And I used basically a little rubber stamp, something like this, a little rubber stamp like this. And I created a large scale mosaic, which would depict milestones, controversies, and elements of the history of CryptoPunks in a cohesive artwork. And I think for me, the interesting part was that I could use basically all of these elements and then have also this link of, the stamp, which is the artwork itself represents a blockchain, because it's stamped on notebooks, which are basically zigzag folded and suspended. And if you look at the notebook itself is like a ledger. The pages represent some sort of transaction blocks, and then each stamp is unique like a hash because of the dust, of the ink, the pressure you apply. Not one stamp mark is the same. And it allowed me basically to use that, tie it together, and then have also this shared commonality with punks being pixelated and me working through this cloud mosaic to create a large scale work that I hope was interesting for people to see and explore and to discover, because there's also 7 basically explanatory panels underneath the artworks explaining some of the references and milestones of the respective period in the history of CryptoPunks.
I think it's wonderful that you took a historical element of crypto art and then created artwork about that, which engages people in a different way than the timeline that you've created. There's multiple formats that people can connect with history, and art is a unique way to explore that visually. So kudos to you for coming up with that.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think it's fun. I think art has a lot of function in our history, but if you think about it, it was always some sort of like a communicator, right? Like artists were painting coronations or wars. And I think for me, it's like we're documenting a new era, a new digital era. And maybe we'll look at it in the same way, like like we would pass a coronation, we will be looking maybe at like milestones in the history of crypto art. Is when we shifted as a society in a new age or something.
Yeah, exactly. So it helps us to measure where we're at along this trajectory.
Yeah, in an accessible way, because, you know, it lures people in. That's what I like to say. That the idea of clouds and art is just such a great way of explaining and guiding people into a subject matter, which might be very technical, complex, and appalling in itself.
Very true. There are many crypto artists who have pivoted entirely to making digital works, but you continue to create both physical and digitally. What's your motivation for making artwork in both of those realms?
Well, I think for me, I work very iteratively, and I like to work basically interdisciplinary, right? It's the exciting thing is for me, like I explore clouds as my subject matter, as the symbol for crypto, and as an element to explain crypto to the general public. And as such, I need to exhibit also in physical places, because the target audience for me is people who are not in crypto and should or could learn about it. And as such, being entirely in our art sphere would defeat the purpose of the educational part for me. It comes also from, you know, some sort of necessity in that regard, that, you know, when I started, and I've been a painter and you know, interdisciplinary artist before I entered crypto, and I have been playing with digital elements to it. And you discover that the opportunities to discover exclusively media-based work are very slim and limited. You know, each, let's say, art center will have, for instance, one monitor, but they have a lot of wall space. So that's where I started pivoting, you know, to including more, for instance, prints, and then using my artwork with art to bring digital art into physical spaces. And yeah, I think I like the idea of being able to do what I want. And I think you know, this, for instance, technical aspect could be best represented through physical work, I wouldn't necessarily deprive myself of that opportunity to do it if I want to. Yeah, I think, you know, everybody can do what they want, but for me, physical art was always a very important part of the process and part of my artistic path and development. So I would not see any reason to abandon it. Digital and crypto art will not replace all art. It is one aspect to art. And I think as such, it would be, for me, not fitting to just give everything up and just focus on one, when I think we have learned that the broader you're set up, the broader you can explore, the more interesting it becomes.
Thanks for that response. And for all the work that you're doing to uplift and celebrate and commemorate the history of crypto art. I'm really grateful for it.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining our conversation with Martin Lukas Ostachowski. If you enjoyed it, make sure to press that subscribe button and leave us a review.
And be sure to join us for our next episode.